So hi, everyone. I'm Amy Mobby, Education Manager at Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. We're so glad that you could join us for tonight's lecture, Cavity Nesting Birds. Thank you to all of our members and library patrons joining us today for your continued support. A big welcome to all of our non-members and newcomers out there. And with you all in mind, let me take a moment to share a bit about our garden. Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens celebrates the wonder of plants and place as a destination for education, conservation, and community connection. We are a 48-acre botanical garden located in the Philadelphia suburbs that specializes in plants native to the region and are home to a world-class collection of rhododendrons and azaleas. Jenkins is open to visitors every day of the year and is always free of an admission fee, thanks to generous community support. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to join our Jenkins family. Tonight's lecture isn't just one of Jenkins' Third Thursday lectures. It's also the final event of our bird theme Arboretum partnership between Jenkins and Tredyffrin Public Library. Again, this summer, we have worked together to provide opportunities to promote literacy, library and arboretum usage, and community conversations. If you have been participating with us reading Slow Birding and attending various programs, don't forget that Arboretum ends tomorrow, Friday, August 16th. Be sure to log into Beanstack before tomorrow to enter your reading and activities, so you'll be in the running to win a prize pack featuring reusable and bird-related goodies, as well as a signed copy of Slow Birding. Now to introduce our presenter for tonight's lecture. Dr. Jenny Uehling grew up in Springfield Township in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and has loved birds since age 10, when her parents got her a Sibley field guide. She attended Springfield Township High School and went on to receive her BS in biology and BA in environmental studies from the University of Chicago, and her Ph.D. in ecology and evolutionary biology from Cornell University. Jenny is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at Westchester University, where she studies the foraging ecology and behavior of tree swallows and eastern bluebirds. So we can't wait to hear from Jenny tonight. So at this point, I will turn things over to her to get us started. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen here. All right, everything looking good?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so like Amy mentioned, my name is Jenny Uehling, and I am currently an assistant professor at Westchester University. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and speak with you all today. It's really wonderful. I am going to be telling you today about cavity nesting songbirds. And before I get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about me. I actually forgot that I sent in that whole bio, so a little bit of this is a bit of a review, but I'll give a little bit more details kind of about how I got to where I currently am. So I grew up in Montgomery County in Glenside, and I went to Springfield Township High School. And I always knew when I was younger that I really liked nature and the natural world and birds. But it wasn't until I went to college at the University of Chicago where I realized I could actually pursue that interest and passion as a career. So I had a number of professors at the University of Chicago that sort of opened my eyes to all of the opportunities within this field. And that inspired me to pursue my PhD at Cornell University. So I went out to the Midwest for a little bit. I came back in the direction of the East Coast, but I was a little bit further north at that point. And if those of you who are listening are familiar with birds, you may be familiar with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is a really awesome place to be embedded within while doing your PhD on birds. So I was really lucky to be there and take advantage of all of the wonderful support through the Cornell Lab. And ultimately, that all led me back here, full circle. To complete that circle, I started my position as an assistant professor at Westchester University in fall of 2023. So I've been there for about a year. And I'm really excited to be back in this region and have this chance to share with you some of my passion about birds today. So today, I wanted to give you a bit of a roadmap to see what to expect in my talk. I'm going to start off by telling you what a cavity nester is, and then we'll talk about some cavity nesters that are especially common in our region here in southeastern Pennsylvania. I'll then get into some information about why cavity nesters are so great for research. They're really wonderful study systems for biologists, and so we'll explain why at that point. Then after that, I will delve into what we can learn from cavity nesters, and I'll specifically talk about some of my own research in that section. And then I'll end my talk today by talking a little bit about what you can do to help these birds. And like Amy mentioned, I'll also be making some references throughout the talk today to this book that I know many of you have been reading as part of the Arboretum event. So I really love slow birding. I've been slowly making my way through the book myself. I haven't quite finished, but I'm getting close. I'm hoping to kind of connect some of the things that Joan Strassman writes about in slow birding to some of the things that I'll talk about today in my presentation. All right, so we'll start off by just going through some simple definitions. What is a cavity nester? Very, very broadly, birds build many, many different types of nests. So I think if you closed your eyes and pictured a bird nest, probably the first thing that would come to mind when you do that is something that looks a little bit like this. So this is an American robin nest, very common in our region. You might have seen these birds nesting close to your home. I know they've certainly done that close to my home. They build what we call open cup nests. So as the name suggests, this is a nest that looks a little bit like a cup. It's often in the crook of a tree or sometimes even on top of your house. And these are kind of exposed to the world. So they do experience high predation rates because sometimes they're not super well hidden and they're very open. But despite, popular media's portrayal of like many versions of this open cup nest, when, you think about, well, draw a bird nest or, a picture of a bird nest, there are actually many, many other different types of nests that birds build. And it really depends on the species, what type of nest they're actually going to build. So one of my favorite examples of a bird nest is this Baltimore oriole nest. These birds are native to our region as well. They breed here in southeastern Pennsylvania, and these birds build what's called a pendulum nest. So they're essentially weaving together grass in kind of the shape of a pendulum, and it hangs from a tree branch. Another one of my favorite types of nests here in southeastern Pennsylvania is the ovenbird nest. So this is a warbler, and the bird is actually named specifically for the way that its nest looks. So ovenbirds build these dome-shaped nests. They're kind of like the open cup nests that we were talking about earlier, but they have kind of like a lid on top of them that's dome-shaped. And many people think that ovenbird nests actually look like ovens. I personally think they look a bit like pizza ovens. So we have many, many different types of nests. This is just scratching the surface of the huge diversity of nests in the bird world. Today, I'm going to be focusing specifically on birds that are cavity nesters. And here I put a couple of different examples of cavity nesting birds so you can get a sense of how widely distributed taxonomically these types of nests are. So we have our downy woodpeckers right here. We have our wood ducks. These are waterfowl. And we even have some raptors. So we have our American kestrel right here. And as their name suggests, cavity nesters are nesting inside of holes. Oftentimes these holes are in trees, as is evident from all of these pictures, but sometimes birds will take advantage of holes in other locations, maybe holes in human structures, for example. In slow birding, Joan Strassman talks about a couple of different birds that are actually cavity nesters, and so I wanted to highlight those birds specifically here. She writes about house wrens, and she specifically talks about house wrens using human-provided nest boxes, but they will also readily use holes that were created by other birds as well. So in this specific example, this house wren is nesting in a hole that was once used by a bank swallow. She also writes about northern flicker. So this is another woodpecker species, again, using a hole in a tree. She also talks about European starlings. And I really like this photo because I think it exemplifies a different type of cavity than we probably see in this region. If you go down to the American Southwest, you will notice that there are a lot of birds that actually nest inside of the holes within cacti. So European starlings are one species that will do this, but you also see this with species like there's non-native parrot species that will use those types of cavities. You see this with woodpecker species down there. So we're not just talking about holes in trees, holes in all different types of plants and other structures. And speaking of other structures, the final cavity nester that Dr. Strassman mentions in her book are house sparrows. And house sparrows are known to use lots of different types of cavities for their nests. In this specific image, you can see that they're using, I think it's some type of like pipe, maybe a PVC pipe. They've conveniently taken it over to raise their young. And as I made reference to earlier, many cavity nesters will actually use human-provided nest boxes to breed in. So this is a really handy feature of these birds. For whatever reason, these nest boxes that we build and set up for the birds are similar enough to the types of cavities that they might encounter in the wild in the absence of us humans. And so they'll readily nest in these, which is really fantastic for both them and for us, because for them, we're able to provide them with extra habitat that wasn't there before. And for us, we get to observe birds, and we also can use them for research studies, which I'll talk about later today. All right, so next today, I wanted to delve into some of the specific cavity nesters in our region here in southeastern Pennsylvania. And this is the first part of the talk where I want to hear what you have to say about this topic. So I'm curious if you have these types of nest boxes in the area around your house or in your neighborhood. And if you do, if there are any specific kinds of birds that you've seen using them. So go ahead and pop your answer into the chat if you have any nest boxes like this near your home, and if there's any specific kinds of birds that you have seen using them. And I'm going to see if I can easily see the chat here. Let's see. Oh, perfect. Okay, awesome. So I'm seeing bluebirds, sparrows, tree swallows, house wrens. Awesome. Chickadees. Beautiful. You guys are, it's almost like you've seen my talk before I've even given it. Bluebirds, sparrows, wrens. Awesome. So yeah, I'm seeing a lot of bluebirds, a lot of house wrens, a lot of chickadees. Beautiful. Awesome. Starlings. Yep, definitely some starlings. I had a bluebird, but sparrows attacked. Yep, that happens. House wrens and chickadees. Beautiful. Cool. So it sounds like all of you have seen these cavity nesters in action. And I think the wide diversity of birds in your answers reflects the fact that there are a lot of cavity nesting birds here in Pennsylvania. So we have about 185 breeding birds in the state, and of those, 35 are cavity nesters. And of those 35, about half of them can't actually excavate their own cavities. So they're relying on nest boxes or on abandoned holes in trees or other types of holes in different structures to build their nests. So we actually have the chance to make a real difference here by providing them habitat to breed. Today, I'm going to be focusing on an overview of some small to medium-sized songbird species that use these types of nest boxes. I don't have time to get into all 35 species. Today, I'm going to highlight 4 of the most common, which many of you have already mentioned in the chat. But I'm happy to chat more about other cavity nesters at the end of the talk. All right, so the first species that I'm going to highlight today is the eastern bluebird. I would say that these birds are possibly the most popular of our cavity nesters here in the state, and for good reason. I think they're really beautiful, charismatic birds. So in the center of this slide, you can see a photograph of 2 bluebirds, and these bluebirds have bluish, I think it kind of looks like a fairy. I'm not really sure why, but I'm going to call it fairy blue backs. And then they have reddish breasts. And a really interesting fact about eastern bluebirds is that they are sexually dimorphic. So that means that the males look different from the females. So if you'll notice in this picture, on the left side, we have a male. The males are a bit brighter in color. On the right side, we have a female, and the females tend to be a little bit more muted in their color. So they still have similar coloration, it's just a little bit duller. Eastern bluebirds build nests that look something like this. So they are built out of straw, out of typically grasses and kind of straw-like material. They're really nicely woven together, and then they lay these blue eggs. So it's very easy to remember what bluebird eggs look like because they are blue. Bluebirds are also really interesting in this region because they are here year-round for the most part. So when I lived in Ithaca, New York, when I was doing my PhD, eastern bluebirds didn't always stick around for the entire year. They would actually sometimes migrate south during the winter because it got too cold for them. But in this specific region, bluebirds tend to stick around for most of the year. Unless it gets really cold, they might leave temporarily, but for the most part, they're going to be sticking around here for the entire year. All right, so our next star of the show, our next cavity nester that I want to highlight today is the Carolina chickadee. The first thing that I want you to notice here is that the Carolina chickadee nest looks wildly different from the bluebird nest. So I'm going to toggle between the slides for you to take a chance to actually look really closely at these differences. So if we look back at our bluebird nest, it has, it's made out of straw and grasses woven together. For the Carolina chickadee nest, it is primarily made out of moss. And it's kind of like piled in there. It's not really woven together. It's just kind of placed there. But the actual cup where the nests, where the eggs are laid, chickadees really like to line that with softer material. So they'll often go out and find like pieces of that fluffy stuff from cattails they like to use, or they might even find hair or fur from different mammals in the region. So that's what they're going to be using to line the cup of their nest. Their actual eggs look something like this. So they are a whitish color with speckles of darker reddish brownish coloration. And similar to eastern bluebirds, Carolina chickadees are here for the entire year. So they're pretty feisty little birds. They're very hardy, so they can last through some of the colder winters that we have here. They're very commonly seen at bird feeders, especially during the winter. The next bird I want to highlight here is our house wren. And again, I want you to notice how different the house wren nest looks from all of the other species we've talked about so far. House wrens like to build their nests out of sticks, and oftentimes they will layer sticks all the way up to the top of the nest box. And there's just a tiny little section of the nest that actually has eggs in it. They will line that little cup with the eggs with softer materials, usually like grasses. But the majority of their nest is actually built out of small twigs and sticks. House wrens will also do this thing where they kind of have a lot of false starts with their nests. So sometimes they'll put a couple of sticks in the box, and then, they'll put a couple of sticks in another box and kind of try them on for size, and eventually settle on which box they actually want to use to lay eggs. But you do find a lot of kind of random seeming false starts of house wren nests. House wrens are different from eastern bluebirds and Carolina chickadees because they do migrate. So they are not here during the winter. During the winter, they go down further south, but they do come back up here in the spring and summer to breed. And a really interesting fact I personally think about house wrens is that they will actually invite spiders into their homes. So if you think about spiders in your own home, humans tend to not really like spiders in their homes. We tend to remove them when we see them in our houses. House wrens will do the exact opposite. They will actually bring spider sacks into their nests and purposely place them there. And it's thought they may do this because the spiders are actually potentially helping the house wrens get rid of some bad insects. So as house wren nestlings are growing up, they will often fall prey to things like lice or mites, these ectoparasites that kind of cling to them and might suck their blood or might eat their feathers. And as you might imagine, these ectoparasites can have quite a negative impact on the house wrens. And so putting these spider sacs within their nest, the house wrens are providing a potential control for these ectoparasites. Once the spider sac hatches and the baby spiders come out, they might actually eat those ectoparasites. So it's thought that that might be the reason that these house wrens are inviting these spiders into their homes. All right, the last cavity nester that I want to highlight today is the tree swallow, which many of you mentioned in the chat. Tree swallows are these really beautiful iridescent blue birds. They have iridescent bluish greenish coloration on their back, and then the plumage on their breast is typically a bright white color. Tree swallows are also migratory, so they spend their winters down in Florida, Louisiana, sometimes into the Caribbean, and they spend their springs and summers here. A really interesting thing about tree swallows is that they arrive in their breeding location pretty early in the season, but they hang out for quite a while before they actually start breeding. And it's thought that they do this because they're kind of vying for territory. They're looking at the nest box options or the cavity options to see where they want to actually lay their eggs, and they spend a lot of time kind of fighting over those territories before settling on a place to breed. You'll notice too that tree swallow nests look still different from the other 3 species that we talked about today. Tree swallows have a really interesting habit of using a lot of feathers in their nest. And there is a fair amount of variation in this. So some tree swallows will use just a few feathers, even down to no feathers. Other tree swallows like this one, this photograph that I took of a bird breeding in Westchester this year, will fill that box with feathers, almost to the point where it looks like you're opening the inside of a pillow when you open the nest box. It's thought that these feathers might have something to do with thermoregulation. So maybe they help to keep the eggs warm. But tree swallows will even get into really intense battles over these feathers when they're building their nest. So you'll see them swooping around, dropping feathers, catching them, getting into little squabbles over who gets what feathers. So they can be pretty ferocious around these feathers. When tree swallows hatch, this is what their nestlings look like. So this is a photograph that I took of a nest where 2 of the eggs had just hatched and the 3rd one probably hatched sometime later that day. When they hatch, like all of the other birds that we've talked about today, their eyes are closed. They're what we call altricial, which means that they're unable to kind of fend for themselves out in the world for the first couple of weeks of their lives. They're unable to really move long distances on their own. They're basically relying entirely on their parents. So this is what those little altricial nestlings look like. In my opinion, they look a little bit like gummy bears. All right, so now that we've covered what are cavity nesters, what are some common cavity nesters in our region, I wanted to take a minute to talk about why cavity nesters are so great for research. In general, I would say that nest boxes are really excellent study systems for biologists and ornithologists looking to learn more about bird behavior and bird breeding biology. And the way I always think about it, whenever I'm thinking about nest boxes and setting up nest boxes, I always think of this quote from Field of Dreams, where it says, "If you build it, he or they will come." In this movie, Field of Dreams, if you're not familiar with it, Kevin Costner's character is told by a disembodied voice, if you build it, he will come. And he ends up building this baseball field on his farm, and all of these former late great baseball players come and play on the field. And eventually his dad shows up. And so I always think of building nest boxes as kind of like Field of Dreams, where if you build a nest box and put it in an appropriate location with good habitat for these birds, they will eventually come. This is really helpful as a researcher because you know exactly where to find the birds. So I have worked on research projects before where we spend hours and hours and hours searching for the nests of different species of birds. For nest boxes, we don't have to spend any time doing that. We know exactly where to find the birds. We know exactly where they're going to nest. And so it really cuts out a lot of time and helps us to pursue some really cool questions because we don't have to spend all of this time just trying to find where the birds that we're studying actually are. It's also a lot easier than in comparison to some other systems to actually catch birds when they're using nest boxes and to take measurements and collect samples from them. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but Again, some of these other systems that folks work in, the methods of capturing the birds can be really time intensive and time consuming, and people involve a lot of people. For nest boxes, you kind of have this location where you can kind of just catch birds inside of their homes. So it makes it a lot easier to do research and to get really good sample sizes to better understand these natural systems. And then finally, nest boxes make for a really good opportunity to kind of understand long-term trends within ecology and within bird breeding biology. So there have been many systems set up across North America and in other places in the world where folks have been monitoring nest boxes over the course of many years. And using these data, they're able to actually understand how things like environmental trends might impact bird breeding success or might impact the timing of bird breeding. And so these long-term studies are really important for biology more generally because they help us understand how animals may be responding to a changing environment. So nest boxes are really an awesome system for a lot of these different reasons. So I wanted to take a minute to delve into some things that Dr. Strassman talked about in her book here. She wrote a whole chapter on house wrens, which, as we know, is a cavity nesting songbird. The little house wren here is circled with a green star. And so for those of you who have read the book, I was curious if anyone remembers some major findings from the chapter about house wrens, and specifically if anyone remembers any major findings that researchers had from studies about nest boxes and house wrens breeding in nest boxes, or just any major themes that you remember from that chapter. So this is another opportunity for folks to drop anything in the chat, and I'll be looking at the chat. Whoops, don't want to reveal my favorite parts. Yes, wrens are aggressive and take over nest boxes of other birds. That is certainly true. I've seen it happen in my own system here in Westchester. House wrens are very territorial, and so they do sometimes compete with other cavity nesting songbirds and take over their nest boxes. Certainly true. Yeah, so someone is mentioning here, Maddie mentions that I had a house wren destroy bluebird eggs in one of my nest boxes. And yes, that definitely happens. It's a competitive world out there, and house wrens will certainly sometimes do this. They are a native songbird, so it's important for us to provide habitat for them in addition to all of these other native songbirds, but it can be a little bit demoralizing when you see that they have destroyed the eggs of other birds. Oh, awesome. But the bluebirds eventually got to have 2 successful broods. Okay, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to share just 2 major findings from this chapter that really stood out to me, but Dr. Strassman talks about a lot of other stuff in the chapter, so I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't read the book yet. So one thing that Dr. Strassman discusses is that house wrens will actually switch mates within and between years. So researchers studying house wrens breeding in nest boxes discovered that sometimes house wrens will raise a group of nestlings with one partner, and then halfway through the season, they'll actually switch mates and re-nest with a completely different partner. And they might even switch between years. So they might choose a different partner the following year to raise nestlings with. So they really switch things up a lot. And one of my favorite findings from this chapter as well that I thought was super interesting was that some of the researchers found that the cost of producing eggs for house wrens is actually what's limiting the number of offspring that they can produce in any given year. So in the chapter, Dr. Strassman discusses how researchers added extra nestlings to birds breeding in nest boxes, and they found that the parents could successfully raise the offspring without any trouble. But when they tried to get the house wrens to lay extra eggs, that was when they actually started to show signs of a cost. And so really it is the cost of producing the eggs rather than the cost of caring for the nestlings that limits how many offspring these birds can produce in any given year. So all of that work was possible because of these nest boxes. The researchers could easily study a lot of different nests because they knew exactly where to find them and could monitor them pretty easily. So again, this is a great example of why nest boxes make for such a fantastic study system. All right, cool. So in this section of the talk, I'm going to get a little bit more specific about what we can learn from cavity nesters. And I'm specifically going to delve into some of my own research on cavity nesting songbirds. I am going to get a little bit into the weeds in some of the sections of this talk, but I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the talk if you want me to return to any of the ideas and kind of flesh out a little bit more of the specific research we were doing. All right, so before I get into my own research on cavity nesters, I wanted to mention that all of this work had to be approved by federal, state, and local entities. So anytime you're doing hands-on work with wild birds, you have to submit permits and get them approved by the Bird Banding Lab, which is part of the USGS. So we have permits from them. You also have to submit permits to states that you're working in. So I have permits from the Pennsylvania Game Commission, as well as the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And then finally, you have to get approvals from your university. And so the universities I was working with during the times that we performed this research were Cornell University and Westchester University. So a lot of approval processes for all of this work, but it's all approved by federal, state, and local entities. All right, so the main two cavity nesting songbird species that I work with are tree swallows and eastern bluebirds. The majority of my work has been with tree swallows, primarily because the boxes that I monitor have mostly had tree swallows in them. But I have been moving a little bit more into eastern bluebirds in recent years. And so the first bit of research I'll tell you about is primarily on tree swallows. And then the second bit of research involves both of these species. A lot of my work is motivated by a desire to contribute to conservation efforts. And I think this desire especially took off when I read this paper back in 2019, this huge work published by Rosenberg and others in 2019 found that 3.2 billion birds have been lost from North America since 1970. I'm going to repeat that fact because I think it's kind of mind-blowing. 3.2 billion birds have been lost from North America in the past 50 years. So we are experiencing kind of unprecedented losses in bird life. And I'm really interested in doing research to hopefully help us to reverse that loss and to bring birds back. The two groups of species that I work with are part of that loss. So tree swallows and thrushes, eastern bluebirds are a species of thrush, are declining across much of North America. This little pie chart here is showing kind of how that bird loss is distributed across different groups of species. And the greatest loss has been seen in groups like American sparrows and wood warblers and blackbirds, but we do also see loss among swallows and thrushes as well. And so in recent years, a lot of folks have been trying to understand possible reasons behind these bird declines. A lot of efforts recently have been focused on aerial insectivores, which are birds that eat flying insects, and that includes tree swallows. And there have been a lot of different possible reasons suggested for this loss. Some people think the loss could have something to do with climate change. Some people think it could have something to do with human development and development of habitat. Some people think it could have something to do with changes in these birds' diets and what they're eating. And so my research primarily focuses on the causes and consequences of variation in diet in birds. And a lot of this is because I'm really hoping to understand how changes in diet and changes in what birds are eating might be contributing to their decline. So today I'm going to be telling you about two lines of work that I have in this specific area, and they're a little bit different in flavor. The first line of work is all about how hormones might be impacting birds' diets. So specifically, I've focused on whether the hormonal response to challenges might impact foraging behavior in birds. And the second line of work I'm going to be describing today asks whether bird diet impacts their exposure to plastic pollutants. Before I get too far into this work, I want to acknowledge many people that have made this work possible. I have a lot of collaborators at Cornell and a lot of lab members and collaborators here at Westchester that have assisted with this work and really made it possible. So thank you so much to all of them. Okay, so I'm going to start off today by exploring this question of hormones and diet. And before we get too far into the diet side of things, I wanted to take a minute to talk about how hormones affect animal behavior. So when an animal, like us humans or like a bird, faces a challenge, hormones help to mediate that animal's behavioral response to the challenge. So ultimately, when we face challenges, this sets off a cascade of impacts that ultimately results in the increase of glucocorticoids in the bloodstream. Glucocorticoids are a type of hormone, and they kind of help to coordinate our response to the challenge. So they help to do things like mobilize our energy reserves and increase our heart rate. And that's kind of the reason that we might start nervous sweating if we're facing some type of challenge. These glucocorticoids are basically turning off some of our body systems that are not important for responding to a major challenge and turning on the things that we do need to help us respond to these challenges. So in us humans, a rise in glucocorticoids might happen in response to challenges like taking a test or maybe competing in a sports event or watching a sports event. Trying to hit a deadline at work. You need energy to be mobilized in order to do that. And many, many other things can cause increases in glucocorticoid levels in us humans. Birds face a lot of challenges as well, but they're probably a little bit different than those that us humans face. And so I wanted to take a minute to kind of brainstorm as a group what challenges birds might face in southeastern Pennsylvania. So if everyone could just take a minute to maybe jot some ideas down in the chat, what are some challenges that you think birds might face in this region? Whoops, I keep revealing my answers here. Let's see. There you go, there's chat. Okay, loss of habitat. Beautiful, yes. Human development, displacing birds, loss of habitat. I'm seeing predation, weather changes, building glass, weather extremes, noise, lights, invasive species. Wow, you guys are on it. You're revealing all of my ideas before I even put them up on the slide. Cats, absolutely. Pesticides killing their insect food. That's a really good one. Unleashed dogs, house cat predation. Yes, beautiful. These are all really awesome ideas. And yes, I think these are all really significant challenges that birds are facing. I love this photograph of the city of Philadelphia because I think it just does such a nice job of exemplifying a lot of the major challenges that birds might be facing, many of them caused by us humans. So for example, things like climate change could really be impacting birds in our communities. These birds are facing increasing temperatures that they're not really adapted to deal with. Someone mentioned predators and especially things like cats, but also predators that are native to this region are big challenges that birds might face. Loud noises can also certainly be a challenge that birds face. Someone mentioned noise from lawn care. Absolutely, that is certainly something that it could cause birds' glucocorticoid levels to rise. Inclement weather conditions are also a big one. And I think someone else mentioned that, yes, weather extremes, weather changes, absolutely. So I know that from when I was a kid to now, it really seems like this region is experiencing like so much more unpredictable weather. We see really intense thunderstorms bringing hail, you know, sometimes even really unpredictable winter weather conditions. So these birds are experiencing much more extremes in the weather and not really things that they're used to dealing with. And then someone also mentioned this, yes, lights. So artificial light at night can be a big factor as well that might cause birds' glucocorticoid levels to rise. They're not used to dealing with light all the time throughout the day. And so that could be a big challenge as well. Well, so going back to our little flow chart here, we've talked about all of the different things that might cause birds' glucocorticoid levels to rise. And before I go much further here today, I did want to mention that the main glucocorticoid in birds is called corticosterone, also known as CORT for short. And so I'll be referring to CORT for the rest of my talk today when we think about this hormone secreted in response to challenges. So with increases in CORT levels, we see changes in activity. And this is due to the whole host of physiological impacts that increasing CORT has on animal behavior. And this also results in changes in foraging behavior. We know this from a number of other studies. We see that increases in CORT can lead to greater foraging efficiency, increases in foraging activity, these types of things. But what we don't yet understand is whether this actually leads to a change in birds' diets. And this is really essential for us to understand because birds' diets could potentially have a really big impact on their health and survival. So if you're still with me right now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, of course birds would eat differently if they're stressed out, because I certainly eat differently when I'm stressed out. For me personally, I know when I am faced with some type of challenge and my glucocorticoid levels rise, I eat a lot of ice cream, donuts, Cheez-Its, really anything that's sweet, fatty, or salty, I will eat. So my diet quality certainly goes down when I am experiencing challenges. And I was really curious if the same is happening in birds, but we didn't know at this point. And so me and my team set out to answer this question. We focused on exploring this question in tree swallows, again, primarily because the population that I was working in was primarily tree swallows. And before I get too far into what we actually studied, I want to talk a bit about what tree swallows actually eat. Tree swallows are aerial insectivores, which means that they eat flying insects. And when they forage, they have a choice. They can either eat flying insects that had their larval stage in water, also known as aquatic insects, or they can eat flying insects that had their larval stage on land, also known as terrestrial insects. And when we think about diet quality in tree swallows, we know that aquatic insects are much higher quality diet items than terrestrial insects. And this is because these aquatic insects have very high levels of highly unsaturated fatty acids, also known as HUFAs. HUFAs are a really important macronutrient. You may be familiar with them yourself because they're a key component of fish oil pills. That is why folks take fish oil pills, because they have high levels of HUFAs. They're also known as omega-3s. So you can see that on this little fish oil pill jar here. You'll notice that this fish oil pill jar advertises that it helps to support a healthy heart, and that is absolutely true for tree swallows as well. HUFAs can promote good cardiovascular function. They also play a role in immune function, cognitive, visual function, all of these things. So in general, we know that diets that are high quality in tree swallows are diets that have a lot of these aquatic insects in them. So with all of that in mind, with our study population in Ithaca, New York, we asked whether elevated CORT levels predict tree swallows' diet quality as measured via the aquatic insect content. In order to do this, we monitored tree swallows that were breeding in our population in Ithaca. We figured out when they started their laying period, and then when they began incubation, we either treated them with a CORT treatment or a control treatment. So the way this worked, for those of you that are curious, is that we put a fake egg inside every nest, and then on that fake egg, we would put a little bit of gel. For birds that had the control treatment, the gel didn't have anything dissolved in it. For birds that had the CORT treatment, those birds had a little bit of CORT dissolved in the gel. During incubation, females develop what's called a brood patch, which means that they lose all of the feathers on their bellies, and they get this really highly vascularized patch of skin on their bellies. And this is to help keep those eggs warm. So we took advantage of this fact, and the female tree swallows that sat on that court gel actually took up the court through their brood patches. And this has resulted in a long-term elevation in court in these birds that lasted well into the rest of the breeding season. So then once the eggs in each of these nests hatched and the birds started feeding their nestlings, also known as the provisioning period, we caught each female bird on day 6 or 7 of provisioning, and we collected fecal samples from her. And then we took those fecal samples into the lab and we performed what's known as fecal DNA metabarcoding. So basically how this works is that you extract the DNA from the feces, and then you make copies of a specific section of the DNA, a special section that will help you to identify the specific insects present. You then sequence the DNA, so you figure out the exact base pairs and the exact order they're in, and then you can use that to match up with other known sequences of insects and figure out the percent of each fecal sample that's composed of aquatic insects. Before I get too far into our results, I just wanted to take a minute to demonstrate some of the different insect families that we found in those samples. We found a lot of aquatic insects, not surprisingly. One insect that I especially want to emphasize here is that a lot of these tree swallows were eating a great deal of mosquitoes. And I think this was really cool to see because these tree swallows are actually kind of acting as a control for these pesky insects that us humans really don't like. So by providing, tree swallow nest boxes out there in the world for tree swallows to use, we are also potentially controlling our mosquito population, which is a very good thing in my opinion. All right, so what did we actually find in terms of proportions of aquatic versus terrestrial insects? So in this figure I'm about to show you, on the x-axis, we have the treatment that the birds received. So as a reminder, we had our control birds that got the gel but didn't have anything dissolved in it. And then we have our treatment birds here, and those are the birds that got the gel with the quart dissolved in it. So they should have had elevated quart levels during the period of sampling. On the y-axis here, we have the percent of the diet that's composed of aquatic insects. So as a reminder, 0% would be a really low quality diet, and 100% would be a very high quality diet. So if we first look at our control birds, the way that these figures work, on the left side here, we have a box plot that shows the median amount or percentage of aquatic insects. And on the right side, we have the raw data shown with these little circles, and then the mean values are shown here with this little diamond. So we see that in general, control birds were eating diets that were composed primarily of aquatic insects. They were like 90%-ish of aquatic insects. But if we look at our quart-treated birds, we see something really, really different. So again here, we're seeing that on average, quart-treated birds have diets that are composed of a much lower percentage of aquatic insects. And I was really excited to see this because it suggested that tree swallows, just like us humans, do in fact stress eat as well. They are eating a much lower quality diet when they have these elevated quart levels. And so if we go back to our little flow chart here, we do indeed see a change in diet associated with elevated quart. Tree swallows are stress eating, but they're not eating ice cream, donuts, and Cheez-Its. They are in fact eating more of these terrestrial insects that don't have as many of these really important HUFAs, these really important nutrients. So more broadly, I think the findings of this study are important because they suggest that in this world that's rapidly changing, we talked about all of these challenges that birds might be facing. In this rapidly changing world, we need to consider how the physiological responses to challenges might be impacting how birds forage, and not just how the challenges themselves are impacting how birds forage. Because there could be big consequences for birds' fitness, for their health, for their population health, and even for the connected ecological communities. So all of the insects that these birds are eating, there could be consequences for them as well. All right, so I'm going to switch gears again here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some ongoing research that I have currently in my lab. This research is pretty preliminary. We just finished collecting samples this past spring, our first year of sample collection. So a lot of what I'll be talking about for this specific section will be a bit more qualitative. We're just getting going with this project, so hopefully I can tell you a little bit more about some of our results in the next few months here. So we were talking about a lot of different potential challenges that birds are facing. I did hear one mention of pollutants. Someone mentioned pesticides, but there are a lot of other potential pollutants that might be negatively impacting birds and humans, in fact, too. One of those pollutants that has been kind of become a growing concern in recent years is microplastics. You see a lot of headlines in the news specifically about microplastics or nanoplastics. There was a study that found that bottled water contains nanoplastics. Another study found that these nanoplastics were present in human arteries and that their presence was related to a higher risk of heart disease. So we're seeing potential negative health impacts. And we're actually also seeing these microplastics showing up in our food. So there have been concerning levels of fiberglass and plastic particles found in oysters and mussels. So this is a big concern for us humans, and it's also a concern for other animals as well. There has been growing research around the topic of microplastics in bird diets. And in this paper published in 2022, researchers highlighted all of these different fragments of plastics found in the gastrointestinal tracts and feces of birds. So in this image right here, all of the pictures that you see, these are all pieces of microplastics that were found inside of birds. We're also seeing the potential of these microplastics working their way up through ecosystems. So in this flowchart, this is a paper that was published in 2020. Researchers found microplastics within prey invertebrates. Basically aquatic invertebrates that birds were eating. And then they found that these American dippers had microplastics in both pellets that they regurgitated and in their feces as well. So we're starting to see not just microplastics within the diets of these birds, but we're also seeing that these microplastics are working their way up through ecosystems, which is especially concerning. So with a team here at Westchester, we have started to investigate microplastics in the diets of birds here in southeastern Pennsylvania. And specifically, we're really interested in whether birds' diets actually predict their exposure to microplastics. So is what they're eating, does that have some impact on the amount of microplastics within them? And then secondly, does microplastic presence predict fitness? So is the presence of microplastics maybe harming the health of these birds or harming their survival chances? And again, here, we are turning to fecal samples. So we are collecting fecal samples from birds and using them in these investigations. We set up this system here in the spring of 2024, so just this past spring. We set up nest boxes in Westchester, specifically at Stroud Preserve and close to the Gordon Natural Area here on Westchester's campus. We monitored these nest boxes throughout the breeding season, and it turned out that the primary birds using them were tree swallows and eastern bluebirds. So we were able to collect fecal samples from both of these species. And this already set up a really interesting dichotomy because, as you already know, tree swallows are eating primarily flying insects, some of them coming from aquatic sources. But bluebirds are actually eating different diet items. So bluebirds are going to be eating typically ground arthropods, a lot of like caterpillars, grasshoppers, etc., but not really eating aquatic insects. So already we have this interesting comparison between species that are breeding in the same habitat, but eating really different types of diet items. Now that we have these species, we split them in half, and half of each sample we're using for microplastic investigations. So we're basically dissolving the fecal matter and then running it through a filter, and from there we're able to identify the small fragments of plastics within each sample, if there are any. We haven't totally confirmed yet, so that it's possible there aren't any. And the other half of each fecal sample, we're actually using for diet metabarcoding. So that same method that I was describing to you earlier, where we extract the DNA from each sample, and then we can identify the specific insects families found within that sample. The ultimate goal here is to be able to understand whether the diets of these birds are predicting the presence of microplastics in their feces, but also whether the presence of microplastics might impact their survival. We also have information from each nest about which birds survived and which ones didn't. And so in the long term, we're hoping to better understand the possible health impact of these pollutants. One other thing that happened during the breeding season that kind of surprised us is that we noticed that these birds are actually putting plastics within their nests. So these are two photographs of tree swallow nests close to Westchester's campus. And you'll notice that each of these nests has pieces of plastic within it. Some of these pieces of plastic are actually clearly identifiable. So this piece of plastic right here, I recognize immediately as a wrapper from a soft pretzel purchased at Wawa. So we know that these birds are getting exposed to plastics in potentially a different way now, not just through their diets, but also in the contents of their nests, unfortunately. And so I've been working with an awesome undergrad here at Westchester, Haley. Eventually, we're going to be collecting these nests and quantifying the plastics and other human trash used by these birds. And hopefully from there, we'll be able to tell whether they might be getting exposed to the microplastics even through the materials that they're using to build their nests. All right, so to end today's talk, I wanted to leave you with a little bit of information about what you can do to help these cavity nesting birds. The biggest thing that you can do, and I've been saying this, I've been hinting at this throughout my presentation today, is that you can set up cavities via nest boxes in your backyard or in local parks. And you can easily purchase nest boxes online. They're purchasable at different garden stores. But if you'd like to build your own, if you scan this QR code, it will take you to a website where there are nest box designs for all different species. So if you're looking to build nest boxes to attract, say, like wood ducks or kestrels or bluebirds, you can find the specific dimensions that are best for that species by going to that website. Another thing that is really important to help cavity nesting songbirds is that you should give nest boxes space during their breeding seasons. Birds breed typically around April through August in this region. And during the breeding season, these birds are kind of going all out to raise their nestlings. They are feeding them typically like once every 15 to 30 minutes. They are really putting in a ton of effort, and they can be pretty easily disturbed by the presence of humans. So if you're nearby a nest box and you notice a bird going in and out of that nest box, maybe take a couple of steps back and give it a little bit more space. Birds do sometimes abandon nests if they are getting too much disturbance, and so it's best to avoid that if possible. So making sure these nest boxes have their space is really essential. And finally, a really great way to help cavity nesting birds is to participate in community science efforts like NestWatch. So NestWatch is just one community science effort, but I wanted to highlight it especially because it's particularly relevant to cavity nesting songbirds. This is a project that's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And in order to participate, you have to take an online quiz to get certified, and then you can go out and find nests, record data about those nests, and submit that information online. And ultimately, those data will be used by scientists to better understand large geographic trends in bird breeding behavior. So that's a really great way to get involved and to help contribute to scientific research. And finally, today, I wanted to put in a plug for any potentially younger members of the audience. So I worked with some colleagues to publish this paper this year about what tree swallows can teach us about biology. You can access the paper by scanning this QR code. And this paper is specifically written for kids ages around 7 or 8 through 12. It was reviewed by kids of that age, and they gave us some comments about how to make it clear. And then it was published in this journal called Frontiers for Young Minds. Frontiers for Young Minds is also a great place to find other research articles for kids about many different really cool topics. So if you're interested in that, I also highly recommend just checking out that website in general. It's an awesome resource for young kids interested in science. All right, so to summarize today, what I've talked about, there are a lot of species of cavity nesting birds here in Pennsylvania, and they make for really excellent study systems. I told you a little bit about my research on the hormonal response to stress and how it can alter tree swallows' diets. And I told you a little bit about some research that I'm getting started trying to understand microplastics in birds here in Southeast PA. And then finally, we can really help provide habitat for declining songbirds by setting up these nest boxes. So if you have the opportunity, it's a really great way to engage with nature and also help these declining birds. All right, so thank you so much to all of the people that have helped to make my research possible over the years, especially to a number of different funding sources that I wanted to acknowledge. And at this point, I am very happy to take any questions. And if you want to contact me or learn more about my research, this is my email right down here, as well as my website. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. Trying to
Oops.
bring myself back here. All right. So if you actually want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, we can go perfect.
Sure.
And I'm happy to ask these questions to you because they have been rolling in.
Okay.
We are going to go back to the very beginning.
Okay.
So back to where you had those wonderful photos of the wren boxes with the spider egg cases. So two people actually asked, do either the baby wrens feed on the spiders or the adult wrens?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that I'm hoping to ultimately answer with my research using that DNA metabarcoding. I'm sure it's a possibility. I can't say for certain. I will say that I have found spider DNA in some of our tree swallow samples. So I'm not sure tree swallows specifically if they're like aiming to eat spiders because they typically eat flying insects, but house wrens could certainly be eating spiders. I'm not totally sure about that though.
This question is about the tree swallow nests and that there were lots of feathers in those. Do they use their own feathers or are they collecting feathers from other birds?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So typically they are collecting feathers from other birds. They find them all over the place. I think like every so often they might like pluck some from themselves, but like typically they're using them from other birds. An interesting anecdote is that I worked right next to this farm at one point that had guinea fowl, which are these birds that have little polka dots on their feathers. And so we would often find the guinea fowl feathers lining the cups of the tree swallow nests, which I always thought was really fun.
For sure. When you spoke about house wrens, you mentioned that they were a native bird. This person's question is thoughts on house wrens prompt the question, should we actively discourage wrens from nesting since they seem to be aggressive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the answer is no. They are a native songbird, and it is actually illegal to tamper with native songbird nests, especially once they start breeding. I would say there are some species that we do want to actively discourage to nest. Going back briefly, though, to the house wren question, I believe there are ways. I'm sure the Pennsylvania Bluebird Society has some good recommendations about this. I believe there are ways to like situate nests or to use like specific sizes of nest boxes to discourage house wrens specifically from breeding in nest boxes. So I would definitely recommend, like, if you're trying to discourage house wrens from nesting, just doing a quick Google search about best ways to attract your target species. There are some species, though, that are not native to Pennsylvania and are really important for us to discourage from nesting in these boxes. So one of them is house sparrow. So different from house wren, house sparrow. House sparrows are native to parts of Europe and Asia, but they've been introduced across the world and they're really successful. They're really successful invaders. Actually, I think I might have had a slide about this. Let me see if I kept it in there. Oh no, I took it out, dang it. So house sparrows will also destroy native songbirds' nests because they're very competitive. They sometimes even will kill the nestlings. And if you Google online like ways to discourage house sparrows from nesting in boxes, there's a lot of different methods. Some people will put like monofilament line near the entrance of nest boxes because it discourages house sparrows. House sparrows, you should potentially remove their nesting material, but it's really important to make sure that you know that it is a house sparrow before you remove it. So yeah, house sparrows are one species that I would say it is important to be aware of them and to remove their nests if you can confidently identify them as house sparrows.
Okay, great. So just to piggyback on that, this person is asking, do you need a separate box for each bird? So just to clarify your statement about nest boxes.
Yeah. So typically, if you set up a nest box, okay, let me think about the best way to answer this question. Birds can be very aggressive about their nest boxes. And so typically if you set up a nest box in a location, there might be like some stiff competition for it. If you're setting up multiple nest boxes, it's a good idea to set them up like 10 to 15 meters apart because that will often minimize competition. Some folks, to minimize competition between tree swallows and bluebirds, one method that actually works quite well for that is to set up two nest boxes right next to each other. In appropriate habitat, tree swallows and bluebirds will actually coexist peacefully. When you set up nest boxes like that, if they're right next to each other, sometimes a tree swallow will nest in one and a bluebird will nest in the other. So many folks will take that approach where they spread out these clusters of two nest boxes across an appropriate habitat, and that works decently well to cut down on competition. But yes, sometimes if you clean out a nest box after a bird has finished breeding and its nestlings have left the nest, if you clean out that nest box, other species might come in and use it later in the season. So sometimes you can have multiple species using the same nest box in a year. But typically at a given time, only a single species will use a nest box at a time.
Great. This person recently built a bluebird box at a library event and was asking where they would install it on their property. It says south facing with a question mark. So I don't know if you have any notes to share about installing bluebird boxes.
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, I would say I try to install nest boxes facing towards the east or northeast. And that's because that way the nest boxes will get the morning sun, but then in the hotter afternoon hours when the sun is going more towards the west and it's a little bit more intense, the birds aren't subjected to that really intense light. I like to mount my nest boxes on T-posts because they're cheap and they're pretty easy to install, but you can really mount a nest box on whatever material you want. Some people will put it on fence posts, really anywhere. For bluebirds specifically, they tend to like open woodland type areas. And so I would try to find somewhere that has open habitat nearby, but is close to woods.
There are a few questions more about, we'll stay with the bluebirds. This says, I'm a nest box monitor and I had a nest that had 12 eggs. Oh, a TS, tree swallow. There we go. Tree swallow nest that had 12 eggs. Was this two females using the same nest?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That is a huge number of eggs. There's very, very low chances that a single female laid all of those eggs and they were all viable. There's a couple of possible explanations for what might have happened. I've seen stuff like this happen before. It could be possible that the female laid a bunch of eggs and then like decided not to incubate them for whatever reason, and then came back later and laid more eggs and just didn't remove the first ones that she laid for whatever reason. It's certainly possible that one female laid eggs in that nest, and then she abandoned, and then another one came in and laid eggs in the same nest. But tree swallows typically do not like share nests. So it would be highly unlikely that that would be two females laying viable eggs at the same time. It's more likely that one of those clutches was abandoned, and then another female or the same female came in and just laid more eggs. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. This question kind of piggybacks on that says, have you ever encountered tree swallows taking over any nests in the way that they had a tree swallow take over a Carolina chickadee nest?
Yeah, that definitely happens. Like I mentioned, there's pretty stiff competition for these boxes. So if you are able to set up multiple boxes, that can be helpful in reducing some of that competition. Um, you do see birds start building nests on top of other birds' nests sometimes. So I've seen this happen with chickadees. I've seen like a bluebird build a nest on top of a chickadee nest. Um, it's really hard to tell when you come upon these situations whether the first nest that was in there, whether that was just abandoned, or whether there was some type of competition that ultimately resulted in the expulsion of one of the species. So it's hard to say for sure, but it certainly does happen quite frequently.
Do you band your study birds, and how do you collect the fecal samples?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't have time to get into the full details about banding birds, but I do band all of the birds that we capture and that are old enough to be banded. Typically, we band nestling birds around day 12 of their lives or later, because that's the time that they're big enough to be banded. Banding birds, we do this with these aluminum bands that are issued by the US Geological Survey. So they have that bird banding lab that I mentioned earlier, and we have to have a whole slew of permits in order to do this. But banding birds helps us to keep track of individuals. So we're able to figure out when we band nestlings, for example, we can figure out which birds successfully fledged and which ones died in the nest. We can also, by banding birds, have a sense of which birds actually come back to breed in our population year after year, which is really interesting and important. So one thing I'm really looking forward to this coming year in Westchester is figuring out which of our birds that bred here in Westchester or that hatched here in Westchester actually came back to breed the following year. To collect the fecal samples, birds in general, especially tree swallows, will usually poop on you immediately after you capture them. So it's actually pretty easy to collect them. Typically what I do for the adults is we capture them in the nest box. So I will pick up the bird from inside of the nest box, and it usually poops on my arm, so I can collect the fecal sample that way. If it doesn't poop on my arm or my clothing, we put it inside of a paper bag and let it sit there for about 20 minutes. And typically it will have pooped after those 20 minutes have passed. For nestling birds, they also have this response where when you pick them up, they almost immediately poop. And that's actually an evolutionary adaptation. So nestling birds will poop in what's called fecal sacs. Like they actually create a sac, and that has all of their poop inside of it. And so when adult birds come into the nest, they'll often like nudge the nestling just a little bit, and the nestling will poop, and then the adult bird will pick up the fecal sac and throw it out of the nest. So this is a way for the birds to keep their nest clean. If you think about like the classic bird poop on your windshield, it's typically like a huge splat. And as birds get older, they stop producing these fecal sacs, and they grow out of it, so to speak. But when they're younger, this fecal sac thing makes it really easy for the adults to keep the nest clean. So we take advantage of this, and we pick up the nestling, and it almost immediately poops, and we're able to catch that poop in a jar. So that's how we collect the fecal samples.
If you haven't by the end of your talk, can you talk about purple martins, their prevalence, and how to attract them? And I do not believe you talked about purple martins, so.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I didn't have the chance to talk about purple martins. So purple martins are another species of cavity nesting bird. They're a little bit bigger than tree swallows and some of the other species I talked about today. They tend to nest in these large colonies. So if you put up a gourd. There are like these purple martin specific gourds that you can purchase. If you put up a purple martin gourd, then these birds in the appropriate habitat, then these birds will often use that gourd for breeding. They have like these huge groups that all kind of breed together. I think, did I get all of that question? I can't remember what the rest of it was. Oh, how to attract them. Yeah, pretty much setting up those gourds is a really good way to do it. You can also, their prevalence in the appropriate habitat, they can be quite common. I see them often nearby preserves. They are probably a little bit less common than some of our other aerial insectivores like tree swallows and chimney swifts, but they are relatively common in this area.
Thank you. What insects are most commonly consumed in this area of Pennsylvania based on your research?
Yeah, another great question. The answer to it is that we don't actually yet know because we haven't finished our lab work for this year yet. So I'm really excited to learn the answer to that question. My guess is that it could be pretty different from the insects that we're seeing the birds consume in Ithaca. I do think that it's possible that they're eating some mosquitoes here. Interestingly, we have collected insects using a malaise trap, which is this big trap that you set up. It kind of looks like a tent. We've collected some insects from the general environment in our area. We're trying to hopefully understand how insects that are available to these birds, like which ones they're actually choosing to eat. And we have started going through those insects, and we're seeing a lot of mayflies. We're seeing a lot of just general flies, Diptera, some leafhoppers. So my biggest guess for what they're eating here is mosquitoes, but there could be a lot more that they're eating that we don't yet know about.
I feel like we're gonna have you back and give us updates on all your exciting research. It's so cool.
Thanks.
Your mention of purple martins prompted one other question, which was, how do purple martins find group nests in the wild?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I don't know the answer. I think that's an answer that a lot of people would love to learn more about. It's really hard to get inside the head of birds. And one of the things that I didn't have time to talk about today, but that I've worked on over the years is actually tracking birds, because I'm really curious in like how they know where to go and where they do go. We can use things like radio tags to do that, which is a whole other topic that, I'm happy to talk about later. But there has been a lot of research trying to understand like how birds find one another and kind of how they move over landscapes and sort of converge on areas. My best guess is that they just end up kind of in appropriate habitat and are able to find each other in that manner. Sometimes they can also use vocalizations to do that. So, yeah.
So thank you for answering all of those questions. That was a lot. I am going to leave us on this note, which is a little bit more of a comment than a question. Nate mentions very informative presentation. Under what people can do, I would also recommend planting native plants and avoiding pesticides. This would develop insect populations for the birds. And I would echo that. And I'll see if you have anything else to share. Otherwise, I was going to just mention what Jenkins has available for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I tend to be so focused on like the actual boxes themselves, but it is really important to also provide these birds with native plants and habitat that actually is conducive to producing native insects as well. So I think that's a great segue to you plugging some of these things, Amy.
For sure. So yeah, so I just wanted to mention for those of you who are local or regional who are joining us tonight, that Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens has a garden shop. Part of it is gift shop, but then a big part of it is an outdoor plant nursery where we sell loads and loads of plants from basically April through, let's say, the end of October. And we sell, I would say the vast majority of things that we're selling are native plants. We have everything from perennials to vines and shrubs and trees. So I would encourage you all, again, if you're local, regional, or want to take a road trip to Jenkins, please come shop our plant selection. And right now our garden shop is open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and we will be open till 6 p.m. through the end of September. And then we're going to shift gears back to our 9 to 4. But fall is such a wonderful time to plant and get plants in the ground. We almost think it's better than spring for planting. So don't be discouraged because it's towards the end of the season. It's actually a really great time again to get plants in the ground and establish their root system in a different time of year. So that's my little plug. For those of you who have asked, yes, we have recorded this talk tonight, and I will include a bunch of the resources that Jenny has mentioned, as well as I will put a link in for our garden shop as well. But Jenny, thank you so much for being with us and for all of your wonderful additions to including our arboretum efforts and slow birding. I really appreciate that. And thank you to all of you who are still with us at this point. Lots of great questions as usual. And so hopefully we will connect again. And Jenny, would love to have you back once you have learned more about the microplastics and other pieces to your research puzzle.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'd love to come back. Hopefully I have a little bit more to share in future years.
Sounds great. All right. Good night, everybody. Take care. Bye.